We have the capacity to live stream debates from various locations for a wide range of clients.
And our online audience, we welcome you back.
We follow them and help build Zimbabwe brand on a positive note.
On the second report on citizens' perceptions.
And for us, our interest has always been around how do we leverage technology to communicate policy, to communicate public issues.
When you think of reaching the ever-growing internet,
churches, who are the people living with disabilities, we welcome you to this meeting, and we would also like to welcome our church leaders as well, who are part of the membership of the Zimbabwe Council of Churches. We welcome you to this meeting. We would also like to welcome our friends as well from Parliament, who make up part of the panel for today with regards to the topic that we have for discussion. So I would like to introduce our panel for today. And our first panelist is Senator Douglas Mwonzora. He's from the MDCT. That's one of our panelists for today. And our second panelist is Honorable Innocent Gonese. Today, we didn't manage to get the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee for Justice and Legal and Parliamentary Affairs. So they managed to send a member of the Portfolio Committee of that committee in the form of Honorable Innocent Gonese. He will be representing the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee. Then our third panelist for today is Professor Love Momaduku. We all know him, I suppose, as a constitutional expert and also as the leader of the NCA party. Then we also have our fourth panelist, who's also a senator in Parliament, Rejoice Timire. She's also a representative of people with disabilities. Our fifth panelist is Senator Wasson Kupe, who's also part of the Parliament, and he also represents the constituency of people living with disabilities. Then our sixth panelist is Tepang Nare. This is a dear friend of ours, the Zimbabwe Council of Churches. They are part of an organization that represents people with disabilities. And our last panelist is Mantate Mlochwa, a young woman, very vibrant young woman in the civic society space, and also a human rights activist who's right now with Magamba Network. So this is our panel for today. And the question we have today, why we are here, is the engagement is titled, Does the Constitution Adequately Locate People with Disabilities? So before we go deep into the depth of the matter or into the topic of discussion, I would also like to welcome Reverend Dr. Gondongwe. He will introduce a very important document that the Zimbabwe Council of Churches as church has managed to put together in terms of solidifying its inclusion agenda. So what happened is the Zimbabwe Council of Churches held a General Assembly last week on the 28th and the 29th of August. And a commitment was made by the 29 bishops of the 29 member churches with regards to the inclusion agenda that speaks to inclusion of people with disabilities, women, children, people from rural communities, and also people from minority groups. So I would like to open this floor for Reverend Dr. Gondongwe. May you please unmute your mic and you introduce us to this policy before we go into the depth of the matter from a theological perspective. Over to you, Reverend Gondongwe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tariro. Greetings to all the esteemed members here connected. As you have heard, my name is the Reverend Dr. Kenneth Gondongwe, representing Zimbabwe Council of Churches. And following what Tariro has already said and alluded to with regards to the most recent biannual general meeting of the Zimbabwe Council of Churches, the following was agreed upon. In recognizing social inclusion of marginalized groups as one main driver of development, Zimbabwe Council of Churches acknowledges the catalytic role that the church can play in processes towards such inclusion. The church embodies a God-given mandate to defend and amplify the aspirations of fullness of life, of vulnerable groups such as children, women, people with disabilities, rural communities, and minority groups. As God says through the prophet Isaiah chapter 1 verse 17, learn to do right, seek justice, encourage the oppressed, defend the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. The delegates at the last Zimbabwe Council of Churches General Assembly, reaffirming the sanctity of human life as created in the image of God, which life should not be demeaned and taken away, but should be respected and protected, recalling the relevant domestic and international laws on gender equality and social inclusion, such as United Nations Resolution 1325, Beijing Platform for Action, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that is CEDAW, Southern Africa Development Community, that is SADC, Protocol on Gender Equality, and the Constitution of Zimbabwe, as well as its subsidiary laws. Realizing from our wide-ranging consultations and researches that women, people with disabilities, youth, children, rural communities, and minority groups are the worst affected by domestic and politically motivated violence, are most impoverished by corruption and poor health, and other social suffering from the impact of natural disasters, floods, famine, and COVID-19, as well as poor policy decisions, struggle the most to access timely and fair justice services. Reiterating the consistently held position that these challenges demand inclusive, credible, and comprehensive national dialogue processes. Remembering the biblical and theological injunctions to uphold human dignity, defend the vulnerable, and those on the margins of the society. The members of the Zimbabwe Council of Churches commit themselves to refining and accelerating the implementation of child safeguarding policies in our churches. Number two, to establish gender policies in our member churches to the effect that at least 40% representation of male and female representation ratio in our programs, staff recruitment, and composition of governance structures in the leadership positions. The training curriculum at Zimbabwe Council of Churches affiliated theological colleges fully embrace and accelerate social inclusion of women in their teaching. Church leaders at all levels should publicly denounce all forms of social exclusion in and outside the church. Our churches provide safe spaces for victims of gender-based violence and child abuse. Establishing disability-friendly churches by reviewing church architecture to ensure improved mobility of and accessibility for people with disabilities. Reviewing education and training curricula at Zimbabwe Council of Churches affiliated theological colleges to ensure that they fully embrace and accelerate social inclusion of people with disabilities. Implementing and supporting the implementation of the inclusive agenda in church hospitals, church schools, and adopting and championing digital inclusion for marginalized and vulnerable groups like women, youth, children, people with disabilities, rural communities, and minority groups through our churches. Initiating and supporting legal and policy reforms to address social exclusion in society. And lastly, supporting and mobilization and organization of socially excluded groups their challenges. Friends, Zimbabwe Council of Churches, in a quest to have an all-inclusive society, as they invite everyone on the table, is big enough to include everyone. So no one must be excluded whatsoever and whensoever. I thank you. Back to you, Tariro.
Thank you, Dr. Rev Gondongwe, for that comprehensive presentation of the Social Inclusion Policy Declaration that Zimbabwe Council of Churches has committed to implement in pushing for its social inclusion agenda and also inputting into the broader nation building agenda. So I would like to also say that without wasting much time, just by roll call, I just want to ensure that our panelists are all in. So I'll just call them out and they may respond by maybe raising their hand or in another way just to confirm that they're in the meeting so that we then go straight into the issues. So I can see that Senator Douglas Mwonzora is in. So I'll assume that he's in the meeting. And I can also see that Honorable Innocent Gonese is also being reflected in the participants as well. He's in the meeting. So far, I cannot see Professor Love Momaduku, so I would want to find out if he's in the meeting. Prof, are you in the meeting? Professor Love Momaduku, are you in the meeting? Okay, so I think he's not yet in the meeting, but that's still fine. He will still join us. I just wanted to find out if I can see Senator Rejoice Timire is in as well. So that's good news as well. I can also see that Senator Watson Kupe is in the meeting as well. That's good news. I can see that Sepang Nare is in the meeting. And I can also see lastly that Mantate Mlochwa is in the meeting. So I think this is a good ground for us to then proceed and begin. So the Zimbabwe Council of Churches has been consulting with people with disabilities for some few months now. And one of the issues that came up amongst many issues was that the constitution we have right now in Zimbabwe does not represent their needs and aspirations. So this is a contentious issue. For me, I felt that we as Zimbabwe Council of Churches could not proceed without trying to find and understand how the constitution is excluding people with disabilities, that's if it's excluding people with disabilities, and what could be done to rectify that issue, because we should have a constitution that speaks about we, the people of Zimbabwe, that is inclusive of all groups in society, especially the minority groups, the marginalized groups. So we found it prudent as the Zimbabwe Council of Churches to convene a meeting of this nature today so that we can trace back historically in the context that in the formulation or in the putting together of the 2013 constitution, what was the thinking of those who were part of the COPAC process with regards to the needs and aspirations of people with disabilities? So the first question today for my panelists is that, what was the thinking during the constitution making process in terms of securing and safeguarding the rights, the needs, the aspirations and the desires of people with disabilities? So I think without wasting time, I'll hand over to our participants who are going to respond in 2 to 3 minutes each with regards to this question. What was the thinking during the constitution making process in terms of securing the rights of the constituents of people with disabilities? So I think I'll start with our representative, a member of the Portfolio Committee of the Legal, Justice and Parliamentary Affairs, Honorable Innocent Gonese. This is over to you. We just want to hear the thinking. You are an expert in the legal fraternity, and we just want to hear what you think the thinking was. That's if you're not part of the process of the crafting of the Constitution. So over to you, Honorable. You may go ahead and unmute your mic.
Thank you very much, Tariro, and a good day to you all. I want to begin by saying that obviously before the advent of our new constitution in 2013, there was obviously a lacuna. The Lancaster House constitution was deficient in that respect. As you all appreciate, This was a constitution which was agreed at Lancaster House in 1979, and it did not have adequate provisions relating to people with disabilities. To start with, it did not even have adequate provisions, and even in terms of definitions, it was only mainly focused on the physical disability and not on other forms of disability, like the mental, like the sensory, and so on. So as it stands, we had a situation where there were representations, and this was the first time when we were now going for a people-driven process whereby there were going to be consultations, and people with disabilities and various organizations representing them were able to make representations. And as such, there was a need to come up with a constitution which was going to be comprehensive. And I'm happy to say that in terms of the actual provisions which found their way into the constitution, you will find that even from the founding values and principles, that aspect is included under section 3, subsection 2. You also go to the to chapter 2. It also covers that. And then you go to the chapter 4, which deals specifically with the rights of people with disabilities. That is adequately covered under section 83. And when you look also at the non-discrimination clause, people with disabilities are also included among the categories of people who should not be discriminated against. And when you again look at the issue of representation, for the first time, we have got 2 seats which are specifically reserved for people with disabilities in the Senate. So in that respect, there was an appreciation that these people needed to be recognized, and the provisions are, in my opinion, fairly adequate. Obviously, there may be limitations here, but I think what is more important is to ensure that we domesticate the full rights which are enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And I believe that the bigger problem that we have is, firstly, that in terms of the actual realization of those rights, there are limitations where the state can give excuses that because it's enshrined that it has to be within the means and resources available to the state, which actually gives them a loophole. And I think that is one, perhaps, one deficiency which is in the Constitution, but be that as it may, when it comes to the actual implementation, I believe that if there is that commitment, if there is the goodwill, we have an adequate foundation in terms of the provisions which are in the various sections, which I've already outlined. Section 22, which is also in chapter 2, gives us those aspirations as a nation. And I believe that it's simply a question of trying to implement what we have. We have got a sufficient framework. We need simply to domesticate and perhaps amend the Disability Act so that all these other aspects which are left out are then included in the Act.
Thank you, Honorable Gonese, for that contribution. From what he's saying, what stands out for me is he says the deficiencies are emanating from maybe there is no implementation of these provides that are found in the Constitution, of these entitlements that are found in the implementation is lacking. And he also speaks of the need for domestication of the full rights of the Convention for people with disabilities. Thank you for that, Honorable Gonese. So now I'll hand over to one of our panelists, Senator Rejoice Timire. What are your views with regards to the historical context of where we are coming from? The constitution making process, do you think it was done in such a way that there was a guarantee of the rights of people with disabilities? Over to you, Rejoice Timire.
Yeah, for me, when I'm looking at the Constitution, yes, as people with disabilities, we fully contributed when it was when it was being formulated. But however, we find that there are some gaps in the Constitution. When we look at section 83, I'm not a lawyer, so the lawyers should forgive me. When we look at the section 83, the rights, yes, but they're not rights. when we talk about resources and you are said when they are available, which means you will never know when these resources are available. And also this was done when Zimbabwe did not have the disability database, where people would really say, we have got so many people. When we are writing our constitution, we are writing something which will represent such statistics. That was not there. And when we look at the other things, we look at when we look at sign language, for sure, yes, we were given the sign language. It's written clearly that it's also one of the languages which is recognized in the Constitution. But when we come to practically, really, you find that the implementation is lacking because you don't find any interpreter wherever programs are being implemented, wherever, anywhere in Zimbabwe, you can't find anyone interpreting to persons with the hearing impairment. Those are the issues which we say as person with disability, there is a shortfall in the Constitution. We were not given the full rights as a people. If you look at ex-combatants, it's mandatory for them to receive what they are receiving now. But when it comes to persons with disability, they are receiving nothing because it's not there in the Constitution. It's vague. That is what I can say.
Thank you so much, Senator Rejoice. And I picked from what you have said. You have said that, yes, there was participation in the constitution making process by people with disabilities, but you also cite that there are gaps in the constitution. Particularly, you have made reference to Section 83, which we feel that in as much as there is giving of rights, the rights still don't exist. And you are also saying that in comparison to provisions for ex-combatants in the same constitution, what they are entitled to is mandatory, and they get it without fail. But why then make the provision for what people with disabilities have to get be loosely translated and not made mandatory? Thank you for that, Senator Rejoice Tinire. So now I also give this opportunity to Senator Douglas Mwonzora to give us his view. I believe he was part of the constitution making process of 2013, just to give us an insight of the historical context of how he sees this process, if it was done in such a manner that it actually safeguarded the rights of people with disabilities. So over to you, Honorable Douglas, Senator Douglas Mwonzora. You may go ahead and unmute your mic.
You can hear me? I hope.
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, Senator.
Oh, thank you very much, Tariro. I want to thank the Zimbabwe Council of Churches for organizing this very, very important discussion. I want also to thank them for coming up with that policy that Dr. Gondongwe has just read to us. Thank you very much for that very, very good work. Yes, I was part of the constitution making process. In fact, I was the co-chair person of the constitution making process. And during the constitution making process, we had a special outreach for people living with disabilities. This special outreach was basically targeted at that interest group in particular. But I do want to admit that it may not have been adequate, but they made their representations and so on. You will find that in the Constitution, you will find the rights of people with disabilities are provided in four sections. As Honorable Gonese has ably demonstrated. First, in the founding values, then you go to the national objectives, you go to the Bill of Rights itself, and then you go to the section that deals with the domestication of international law, inclusion of international law, international conventions into our legal system. They are also included. So the rights of the people with disabilities are contained in section 14. You find in section 14, we deal with empowerment, and then they are mentioned there. But unfortunately, Section 14 is aspirational. It's not mandatory. It's aspirational. It depends on the resources available to government. Then you go to Section 22 of the Constitution, recognizes the rights of people with disabilities. Again, unfortunately, this is aspirational. But if you go to Section 83, you have the rights of the people living with disabilities to facilities to realize their full mental and physical aspirations. They have to be self-reliant, and they are given the right to be self-reliant, the right to have a family, the right to creative and recreational facilities, the rights against exploitation and abuse. Then you have right to access to medical, physiological, and functional treatment. And very, very importantly, there is the right to free education. People living with disabilities have the right to education, free education from primary level to tertiary level, if they need that education or if they so desire that education. So if you look at it, it is a good thing to have. Unfortunately, we had to put in there that it had to depend on the resources available to the state. And that is where the problem is. The state will always plead indigency. The state will always say it does not have enough money. So what that means is that we have rights which are not fully recognizable. And I've seen a lot of my friends living with disabilities without access to a lot of facilities. If you look at our buildings, most of our public buildings do not have facilities which make them friendly to people who are living with disabilities. A lot of our social processes, our political processes, and so on. If you look at the voting process, the ballot, the designation of the ballot, there is no designation of the ballot which is friendly to people living with disabilities, especially the blind. And I think that is the mistake. But most importantly, we left a lot of things to key legislation. A constitution will provide for things in a general way, and the rest specific issues are left to legislation. And the legislation and policy of this country leave a lot to be desired. I have seen a lot of people who live with disabilities who are extremely gifted. And people who come to mind as my friend who has just spoken, Senator Timire, a very astute member of the Senate. We have my friend Senator Coupe, and so on. And they are very competent people. We had the late Pearson Nerere, who was one of our best law lecturers ever in the history of our country. And so if we do not pay attention to this group of individuals in society, we lose a lot of talent. We lose a lot of revenue. The statistics regarding how many people are affected are not very reliable, but I've heard figures like 2 million and so on. So we need to make sure that the rights that are provided in Section 83 are concretized, that they are protected and given effect to by number one, legislation, number two, the government policy. I still also think that because of the absence of the database of people living with disabilities, it was not very possible to accurately quantify their representation in Parliament. And I think that their representation in Parliament is still very low. So there is a lot that can be done in this category.
Thank you so much, Senator Douglas Mwonzora, for that. I think it's more legal, and I think it has been helpful for us because you are citing that the provisions that speak to the needs of people with disabilities, most of them are aspirational, the ones that are found in the Constitution. And you've said there is just need for us to concretize those desires and aspirations and their entitlements backing with law and legislation, not just to rely on just the Constitution. So you've already spoken of the issue of weak laws that back up the constitutional provisions for people with disabilities. Then you've also raised a very important issue where you are saying that there is so much capacity within the constituency of people with disabilities, but that capacity is seriously under-recognized. So we lose a lot of human resources, as you've mentioned. We lose a lot of capacity by not recognizing the capacities found within that constituency, which is really important. And I also heard you speaking on the issue of the absence of a database, which makes it a bit difficult for there to be concretization with regards to policies around people with disabilities or issues that affect them. So this has shown us that it is now problematic because there is no database. It is absent. Thank you for your contribution, Senator Mwonzora. So with that, I will then move on to the next panelist, Mandate Mlochwa. I would like just to hear from a young woman's perspective. What is your view? What do you think happened in the constitution-making process with regards to locating the desires and the aspirations of people with disabilities? Over to you, Mandate Mlochwa.
Thank you so much for the this clear before I get there. The question of where included or are included even today in the implementation of the Constitution comes from two angles. There is this one side that's constantly reminding us that there are provisions of the Constitution that make that actually open up to the empowerment of making provisions for persons with disabilities. So the assumption now is because there are certain provisions, that means somehow they're represented. But we also need to understand that when we go back to the constitution making process, the question we're trying to answer is, were persons with disability part of the voices that resulted in those provisions that are made? I think that's the question we're trying to answer. And then I was just looking at the statistics of the participation in terms of the national outreach that was done by COPAC for the Constitution of Zimbabwe. So you discover that of the 1.18760, 1.1 let's just say 1.2 million people that actually were reached out to, about 8,020 of those were persons with disability. That's actually less than 1% of the national outreach. So I think that answers this question for us, where we're saying because of the numbers themselves, that a lot of these persons with disabilities did not give a voice to the process. That means whatever provision that was made, the reason why we're having this conversation today is because these provisions are problematic. They are not addressing questions. So it means that whoever they were made for is not happy with what we have. That means they did not give a voice. And then the other problem that I think was really big from the onset was the idea that the government statistics around the number of persons with disability in Zimbabwe and the statistics that are there, for instance, in institutions like the World Health Organization in 2011, they stated that about 15% of our population in Zimbabwe is made up of persons with disability. But the government actually states that about 130,000 are actually persons with disability. So you can imagine that the discrepancy in the statistics already tells you the mindset of the people that sit down and say, we're doing a national outreach to get Zimbabweans' opinions on a new constitution. So already, if you're not confirming the number or the true reflection of the number of persons with disability, I don't think that you're in a good place to actually make provisions for those people. And then the other thing I wanted to state as well as a closing statement from my end is that there were some factors that I was just reading about with regards to the way the COPA process, the constitutional making process actually went through. You discover that there was a lack of recognition of the unique needs of persons with disability. If you're looking at issues of access to facilities, to say some of these consultations that are normally done by the state, they're in certain venues where if you had a wheelchair to start with, you're not able to access this facility. So before I even come to questions of how do I communicate myself to those people, there's a question of how do I even get inside the venue. But you also look at limitations in terms of the distance to the venue from where those people are. So that's another big question. There's issues of also the sign language. How many of the people that were in those teams were actually able to listen to those people through the different ways in which they speak? So there's also an issue of the braille access as well. There's issue of ablation facilities. And also the one thing that we need to also understand was that the environment upon which the Constitution of Zimbabwe was made in that time was very politically polarized. The battles between the MDCT, the MDC, talk about, for instance, section 155 of the Constitution that talks about the election and participation, to say everyone is supposed to participate despite the differences. And then you also get someone, okay, we get examples of how there are 2 seats that are set aside in Parliament for persons with disability. But you discover that that provision is not even clear about whether this person is supposed to be a person with disability or not. So it leaves this room for anyone to be in there as long as they are assumed to actually represent the views of the persons with disability. That's my submission.
Thank you so much, Mantate Mlochwa, for that very energetic, very vibrant contribution. And from your contribution, what stands out to me is the fact that you speak of the voices of people with disabilities in the process, not event, but process of the constitution making. So here you are speaking of how the voices were not amplified as they should have been. And you also speak of the issue of the attitudes and the mindset of institutions of the state that are meant to push and propel the agenda for people with disabilities, that are meant to safeguard the interests of people with disabilities. The negative attitudes are some of the reasons why there's no full commitment towards the realization of the rights of these people. So we also see that you also mentioned that at the time when the constitution was being made, the environment was very political. So at the end of the day, the agenda of people with disabilities was drowned out at the expense of possibly the voices of mostly the political agenda. Thank you for that, Mantate. So I'll also hand over now to Senator Watson. You may give us your contribution briefly in 2 minutes, what you think happened at the constitution making process in terms of locating the needs and the aspirations of people with disabilities. Over to you, Senator.
Thank you very much, Dariro. Greetings to all who are participating in this meeting. I want to start by saying we are not people living with disabilities. Some of us will live with our families. We are people with disabilities, period. Well, I was part of the Constitutional Commission in 1999, the referendum of which was rejected in 2000. And I also participated at the COPAC effectively as an active participant representing persons with disabilities. In both processes to amend the constitution, disabled people, persons with disabilities, came in numbers. Persons without disabilities, even in rural areas, and Mkoma Dagi, Honorable Douglas Mwonzora is my witness, because by that time he was chairing COPAC, and he was really supporting us, and we'll never forget him for that. But I think the mistake happened. Perhaps it's not a mistake. It was deliberately, and unfortunately, Honorable Mwonzora was also part, I think, of the committee which finalized the document. Many contributions, many things which are said by disabled and non-disabled were thrown away. For example, almost all provinces we traveled, they'd agreed that at least 15 seats should be set aside for persons with disabilities. But we ended up having 2 seats, not in Parliament, but at the Senate. So what it means is that we ended up having a drop of cold water on a hot stone. There is no absolute representation which can actually be said is representation. Yes, it's okay that we are 2, but it's not okay that we are only 2. We need to increase that, and we need to have some people at the lower house. Now, all of us know that we are almost through in having the finalization of the amendment of the Constitution. Ironically, there are going to be 10 seats for youth. And by the way, in terms of the Constitution of Zimbabwe, or in terms of the attitude of Zimbabwe, even in the legislators, when we say youth, it's a tacit approval that they are saying as long as they have no disability. If we say women, we say women in Zimbabwe, but inside our mind, the setting is that as long as those women have no disabilities, Because if you were inclusive enough to have people with disabilities also included when we say women, these proportional representation of parliament will be having disabled women from each province. By so doing, we're having 10 extra women with disabilities in their diversity. But all the parties who are in parliament simply do not do that. I want to go home right now, although it might be controversial. It's lucky, and I'm happy that Honorable Douglas Mwonzora is here as well. Even in the recallings that are taking place in the replacing, I can bet my last to say that there is no person with disabilities. Is that a mistake or is that attitudinal? It's a clear discrimination. So I'm saying the constitution itself just does not take into account the aspirations of persons with disabilities. We can say the number is what we want, the quantity. The right of an individual, the right of citizens has nothing to do with the population. That there are 1,000, 2,000, 50,000, 2 million. We don't need to go as far as that. That is an extra we can do after. But what is important is that are we really taking into account the rights of 60,000 people, if they are 60,000 or 2 million, as long as they are minority? The answer is that in Zimbabwe we are not. In other words, even legislators like Honorable Gonese, I like this statement, although it surprised me, that look, what needs to be done is perhaps to come with a legislation which will actually fill what was left at the Constitution. I don't think it may help, because it's like you're having a shadow, you are sitting under a shadow, and the shadow is bent, it's not straight, it's not put properly. You struggle to want to correct it. You are wasting your time. What you need to do is to correct the tree, which gives birth to that shadow. So if we deal with the Constitution, I mean, if we deal with the Disabled Persons Act and the bill, is what we are saying, as long as it does not go along with the provision of the Constitution, it's just a waste of time. You know that anything, any act which does not align with the Constitution is not proper. So without wasting time, I simply say, I think we need to go back and come up with a Constitution which will say, I think it's page 45. It's about the rights of the elderly. It's clear that we'll do this. But when it comes to the right of persons with disabilities, the narration just under is different. So I think what is important is that we need to be clear and come up with a better constitution that will take into account the right of persons with disabilities. Not that will give a guess as to say, if the resources are permitting, how do we measure? There's no clear measurement as to how will those resources be said to be enough. It becomes something which is not clear to me. The Constitution gives a tacit approval for discrimination against persons with disabilities. Tacit permission, tacit approval, tacit whatever in favor of the state. And we are saying this needs to be corrected. I think with these few words, I have to give others a chance. But the truth is that the Constitution of the Republic of Zimbabwe is not pro-disability. And well, let me finally say, disabled themselves are the ones who are supposed to say this Constitution is not correct. Anybody else without disability who says the Constitution is correct, what is needed is this and this, I don't think that's the best way. There's what they call self-representation. Kana uchirwadziwa negumbo chigumwe chero karapiwa na doctor unofana kubvunza, and vakangwara madokta vanobvunza kuti zvino chizuri kuita sei, kwete kuti dokta iti zvava right, wangosara chendiko kuzodza musunga uya ayo zvava right. That's what I appear to be gathering from the learned lawyers we have as participants here. Thank you, Tariro. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Senator, for that profound submission. And you actually touched on a number of issues that I think you spoke of the issue of attitudes that Mantate had raised, where you are saying that the exclusion of people with disabilities, is it by mistake or it's an issue of attitudes? And I like the fact that you spoke of the analogy of the shadow and the tree. That gives the proper picture of where people with disabilities are in the national agenda. That analogy is so befitting. Thank you for that. So I like the other issue that you raised, Senator Watson Kupe, where you say that political parties themselves have ignored the issue of representation with regards to people with disabilities within their own structures. So how then do we expect that to then transcend or move to the national in terms of representation in parliament, where you have only said, which is really appalling really, where you spoke of the representation being 2 seats out of 15, which are only in Senate and not in parliament. It is actually a paltry representation, which should be a cause for concern. And the main issue with regards to the constitution-making process is the one where you said that many contributions were made. People were widely consulted. People with disabilities and people without disabilities made contributions, but those contributions were just thrown away. What a travesty of justice. So now I'll give this opportunity to our 7th panelist, Tepang Nare, in 2 minutes to 3 minutes. What do you think happened? Oh, thank you for that, our participant over there. So Tepang Nare, I would ask that you just give us your contribution towards the constitution-making process. If you think enough was done to secure the needs, aspirations of people with disabilities.
Okay. Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity. I will dwell on 3 key and critical aspects that persons with disabilities had during the constitution making process. The first key aspect revolves around recognition and upholding of their inherent dignity, which is enshrined under Section 3 and Section 56. Section 3 goes on to say the principles of good governance are binding on all states and its institutions and agencies of government, which includes persons with disabilities. So the persons with disabilities were looking forward to a constitution that emphasizes their recognition and upholding of their dignity. So that's the first key point. Second key point, persons with disabilities were looking forward to strengthened social protection mechanisms. Strengthened social protection mechanisms are there to alleviate poverty and inequality. Remember that poverty and disability are at par. So when this process was being done, they were looking forward to having certain provisions that are strengthened to look into their social protection. Number 3, persons with disabilities were looking at the issue of self-representation that I've heard my other colleagues allude to over and over again. Why self-representation? Disability is cross-cutting across all ministries where decisions are being made. Disability is bound to feature. But what did we get? We got a constitution that objectifies persons with disabilities. That's why the previous speaker, Honorable Watson Kupe said, I don't think it's proper to say the constitution is okay, we did all that we could without getting to hear the voice of persons with disabilities. So the constitution objectifies us, because if you look at section 83 that you've been alluding to, there was like to provide to assist to do this. And then you wonder and say, okay, even if the state is obliging to its mandate, but where is my voice in this provision and in this encouragement? Because at the end of the day, even if you are to provide something, because I've got a right, I need to say something. To say, I know what is provided is okay, but why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do ABCD? But in the Constitution of Zimbabwe, there is nothing of that nature, number one. Number two, there is deliberate actions that were done. Because if you look at a section on children, look at a section on women, look at a section on youth, they say reasonable measures. For children, it's reasonable policies. But for persons with disabilities, it's within the limits of resources available. Then you wonder and say, are resources needed only for persons with disabilities? This question is tabled to those who are part of the constitution making processes, because youth need resources, children need resources, women need resources, but there is nothing of that nature. As when it comes to disability, it's within the limits of the resources. And then the Constitution goes to say, we'll provide ABCD, we'll do this. There is a contradiction there, because even if it's written that the state will do ABCD, then you'll say, but how are they going to do it since there's already said within the limits of the resources provided? The issue of equal participation is not mentioned in the Constitution. That if you go to women's issues, there is participation of women in political, economic, and social issues. Go to youth, the same is there. But for persons with disabilities, is to provide them. So there was a piecemeal approach, and when the Constitution was being done, I'm sorry to say, the charity model was being used. Yes, we appreciate that the state was obliging to its mandate of assisting its citizens. But in assistance, I have to have a voice. With that said, thank you.
Thank you, Tepang, for your very, I would say it was a very comprehensive submission, one that has also enlightened me with a few issues that you have raised. The first one is the issue of self-representation. You have mentioned it. It's something that also Senator Watson Kupe also spoke about, that the issue of disability is cross-cutting and it should not be viewed as one homogeneous group, and that it seems as though the Constitution actually objectifies people with disabilities. The other issue that you also raised was that the issue of the provisions for people with disabilities within the Constitution, it has the qualification that says if resources are permitting. Yet you have mentioned that the issue of resources is cross-cutting. It also touches on women. It also touches on children. But why should people with disabilities be confined with a qualitative statement that speaks of whether resources are permitting for them to realize or enjoy their rights? The other issue that you also raised that is of interest is that there was a piecemeal approach to the constitution making process with regards to the interests of people with disabilities. You also spoke that the model that was adopted, I'm hoping Senator Mwonzora can hear this. I'm also hoping Senator Watson Kupe can hear this, as people who were part of the process. Tepang is also speaking of the issue of the adoption of a charity model with regards to the constitution making process, specifically with the interests of people with disabilities. So this is now really interesting, and thank you for that, Tepang. It was quite enlightening. You also spoke of the issue of there's a need for strengthened social protection mechanisms to alleviate two issues: poverty and inequality that affects people with disabilities, which you are saying at the present moment is absent. So without wasting much time, we'll go into the second segment of our meeting today. The second question that I would want our panelists to attempt to address or to attempt to answer or respond to is the fact that Senator Watson Kupe actually spoke about this, that there is a proposal to amend the Constitution. So our question now is, are these proposals sensitive to the aspirations and the needs of people with disabilities? So our question now is, there is a proposal to amend the Constitution. And in these proposals, we are now asking the question that, is there any sensitivity towards the aspirations and the needs of people with disabilities? So I'll start with Honorable Gonese. You may go ahead. Honorable Gonese, you may. Honorable Gonese, you may attempt to respond to the question where we are saying that there are proposals to amend the Constitution. So do you think that in those proposals, has there been a deliberate thought towards the constituency of people with disabilities? So you can go ahead, Honorable Gonese, you may unmute your mic and respond. Thank you. Okay, so I can see that Honorable Gonese may not be in. I'm not sure if Professor Maduku has managed.
Hello, I'd lost my connection.
We cannot hear you, Tariro. Are you still connected?
Yeah, I've also lost the audio. I cannot hear anything.
Yeah, maybe we can. I think she was calling Honorable Gonese to proceed. I don't know if he is connected.
I am connected. Can I speak now?
Yes, you can go ahead, Honorable Gonese. You may respond. We just wanted to hear what your thoughts are with regards to the proposed amendments in terms of how, is there any sensitivity towards people with disabilities? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the problem with the amendment
colleagues, may we mute ourselves, please?
Okay, can I proceed?
Yes, please proceed, Honorable.
Yes, thank you very much. I was going to start by saying that the biggest problem with this amendment is that there was no consultative process.
Shut up.
The public as to why we decided to have an amendment. As a result, there were no proposals coming from the people of Zimbabwe, but rather it was the executive which came up with a raft of amendments which do not address the needs of the people generally. And more specifically, it is actually silent. If you look at those amendment proposals, they relate, for example, to the removal of the running mates, they relate to the issues relating to the judiciary, to devolution. And the only aspect which could involve representation of people is in the extension of the women's quota and the introduction of the youth quota. And I think, as they already correctly pointed out, we now have got a proposal in the amendment number 2, in terms of which there will be special reserved seats for the youth, which are just going to be 10 in number. And I think that is the only way you can have a small window of opportunity to try to address. And when we had our consultations as the Portfolio Committee on Justice, legal, and parliamentary affairs, representations were made that within the women's quota of the 10, you could then have perhaps a special provision to say that out of that number, you should have a specific number reserved for women with disabilities. But unfortunately, that will not deal with the aspect of men with disabilities. So in my view, that amendment does not address the issue of people with disabilities, but more importantly, we still got a challenge as well, because the debate in the National Assembly will be largely confined to those proposals which have already been tabled, where public consultations have already taken place. And one issue which has already been adverted to is the issue of representation in the National Assembly. In the National Assembly, there's no special provision, but I think that it could have been covered if there had been adequate consultations before the gazetting of the proposed amendment. But because that was not done, they are been left out. Again, no one has talked about the issue of local government. If you look at the urban councils and the rural councils, there's no provision whatsoever for representation for people with disabilities, as opposed to what you have in the Senate. And I believe that if this had been done, this would have been a window of opportunity to address all the shortcomings that we have in the current constitution, and in particular where the issue of that limitation clause, where it says that within the resources available to it, and the state can always give excuses with respect to war veterans. I think Senator Coupe ably pointed out that the clause relating to them is specific, it's mandatory, that resources to be made available. And I believe that these are amendments which could have been done. But in the absence of the consultative process, people were not able to come out with the shortcomings, with the gaps which are in the current constitution. That is the disadvantage that we have. But before I conclude, I want to say to those who sit in the Senate, the bill is currently before the National Assembly. And I believe that in terms of the debate, some of us are going to raise the issue that let's use that window of opportunity in terms of which there's going to be the extension of the women's quota to also include and cater for people with disabilities, although this would only apply to the women because it does not address the issue of the constituencies. But in terms of the constituencies, there have been proposals which have been made, but unfortunately they are not covered in the amendment which has already been tabled, whereby the electoral law would have been addressed, whereby in terms of the actual seats, because we appreciate that those people who have got disadvantages, the women, those with disabilities, it's difficult for them to compete.
Thank you for that, Sean. Sincere apologies to all our participants for that. We just need to make sure maybe we stick to the agenda for the day to make sure that this meeting is as constructive and as beneficial for the constituency it's meant to represent, people with disabilities. So as we carry on, I would have wanted Professor Love Momaduku to have been part of this process, but I can see that he might have failed to join the meeting. So we proceed. Thank you, Honorable Gonese, for your contribution with regards to the proposed amendments. And if in any way there was sensitivity towards the needs of people with disabilities, you have mentioned that these proposals are very silent on the needs of people with disabilities. You have also mentioned that there is the limitations in terms of with regards to if resources are permitting, and there's nothing being said in the proposed amendments about the needs of, and you actually spoke of an opportunity that may have been squandered by legislators with regards to this process of amending the constitution, whereby this must have been the opportune time for there to have been tabling of the issues that need to be amended that incorporate the aspirations and the needs of people with disabilities. Thank you for that, Honorable Gonese. So now, without wasting much time, I'll hand over to Senator Mwonzora. Just to hear from you, Senator Mwonzora, now you've heard of the proposed amendments. What do you think are the windows of opportunity there for people with disabilities? And are these proposals in any way sensitive in the needs of people with disabilities? Over to you, Senator. You may unmute your mic.
Sorry about that, Tariro. Which panelist is meant to be going next?
With your video adverts, think SlyMedia TV online. If you want to pre-package TV programs, documentaries, weddings and church services, think SlyMedia Productions, building bridges. Your TV on the go, anytime, anywhere, worldwide. At SlyMedia Productions, we offer live streaming services to companies willing to...
Next, thank you for unmuting my mic. Thank you. I don't know if Senator is still there. Let me check in the list of participants. He might have dropped out of the meeting. So anyway, that is fine. I think we can carry on with the other panelists. So with regards to the proposed constitutional amendments, I don't know if Rejoice Timire may have something to say with regards to that, if she feels that the needs and the aspirations of people with disabilities are actually being recognized in the proposals. Rejoice, you may unmute your mic and go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, looking at the amendments which are being done, I think when they were drafted, they didn't have people with disability in mind. But as we look at it, I think it was an opportunity for us also to say in the women's quota, we were supposed also to get just something. And in the youth's quota, we're supposed to get something. And I think if it is possible, I don't know with the lawyers, if it is possible, if we can push for this, so that we can also get something from these two, I think that would be the best for us. And it's an opportunity for us to also lobby for it to happen. I don't know whether it is still, it can still happen. It depends with the lawyers who know the law, because I'm not a lawyer. But I think we need to push for it.
All right, thank you for that, Senator Rejoice Timire. You are speaking of the issue that there is nothing for people with disabilities, and you are actually proposing that maybe in those proposals there may be need to locate people with disabilities in the women's quota and also in the youth's quota. Thank you for that contribution. So now I'm trying to see if our other participants are still there, our panelists, so that we move on to the next segment. Mantate Mlochwa, are you there? What is your view with regards to the proposed amendments? Do you think people with disabilities were actually thought of in the process? Was there sensitivity towards that constituency? And if they were not considered, what do you think are the reasons why they were not considered? You can go ahead, Mantate. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I think I would agree with the previous speaker that if you look at the provisions or the clauses of the constitutional amendment bill, you discover that there is none that is actually based on the need to improve the inclusion of persons with disability. So these amendments are independent of persons with disability. So when they come in now to say we at least need to be included in clause 11, for instance, where we talk about the extension of the women's quota and the introduction of a youth quota system, this is more to say, since we are not a part of this thinking process, maybe we can try and push ourselves in, which should never be the process in the way that we make our constitution or in the way that we choose to change our constitution. Our constitution should be able to sit down and say, there's so many things that people have mentioned today that they are saying that are not responding to the unique needs of persons with disability. For instance, the emphasis that was given that disability cuts across all ministries, departments, it cuts across a lot of things. So at the end of the day, it's really about how do you intentionally, as a government and whoever else is involved, how do you intentionally include the face and voices of persons with disability in the thinking process before you even come out and say we want to change the constitution. And then also on the issue of the quota system and the need to potentially push in the idea of at least let's have persons with disability being a consideration in that 10 cents that are set aside for young people. I think the danger in that comes in two ways. First of all, as a young person myself, I do not endorse this proposed quota system for young people for a lot of reasons. And so when we come in and say that for persons with disability to be included in the cut across also to the women's quota, where, for instance, young people constitute about 62% of the population of people in Zimbabwe. And as I mentioned, 2% of that should then be young people with disability. So at the end of the day, when we come in and try to push ourselves into a space that is trying to convince us that 10 seats are adequate for young people, that constitute 62% of the population, it becomes problematic because we are endorsing this youth quota. And then the other thing about the youth quota that we need to understand is that it works just like the women's quota system, where 2/3 of that is going to go to ZANU-PF. So already for me, that's very problematic because it assumes that every person with disability, every young person, every woman that should be in parliament speaking into the process of the legislative process in Zimbabwe must belong to a certain political party. And if we're very familiar with our political environment in Zimbabwe, it's very toxic on both ends, the opposition parties and the ruling party as well. So I think it becomes problematic because already it pushes everyone. We're supposed to somehow be in some political party. It's a problem for me because it also assumes that persons with disability are supposed to be in political parties. Someone mentioned earlier that political parties themselves are not making deliberate provisions for the maximum participation or maximum voices of persons with disability. So you can imagine that in a setup where there's a youth, really as a government who wants to include the voices of young people, of women and things like that, there is a need to deliberately build of competing for parliamentary seats. And then the last thing I want to say that I really think we should be having as something that we think about is that a quota system in itself is not an end that allows for young people, for women, for persons with disability to actually compete in a fair environment that is not harmful to them and actually win political seats and be in parliament outside of quota systems. We will be administrating a quota system. So the situation that has been there in Zimbabwe is such that it's as if we are going to live our entire life. For me, it's worse because I'm a young person, I'm a woman. So my entire life, I have to depend on a quota system to make it work for me, for my voice to be in parliament. So I think if the state has an interest in including the voices of young people living or with disability, we need to make sure that we deliberately build their capacity. And I think also issues of capacity come into issues of, do I understand the constitution itself? That means that it comes in braille, it comes in audio format, it comes in sign language, it comes in the different languages that I understand as a young person with disability. And this whole idea of this COVID regulation, so we can't meet with too many people. So it was done in a very short space of time. And even though there were attempts to make, to provide for platforms online and online submission and things like that, if they actually get access to this information in a way that they understand it. And they are able to also produce something that can contribute to the entire process in a language they understand. In going down to whoever else is involved is the issue of the political will to include persons with disability. Then the last thing is the issue of priority. So many people have coming in to say that when it comes to persons with disability, there is always that statement. It actually comes across different sections of the Constitution. Access to infrastructure, access to health, access to education within the resources available. And for me, the issue of within comes around as an issue of priority. How does the state decide that this is within our priority? This is within the limits of our resources. If you look at the way we spend money in this country, issues of corruption, you cannot tell me that within the means or within the resources available, when parliamentarians are demanding certain things that don't make sense to me, especially as a young person, for someone living with disability who right now is stuck at home because they're not able to sell whatever they sell on the street. So at the end of the day, I think there is need for prioritizing in our government to say if priorities need to reflect that we are actually making considerations to say if we have how much as a country in this year or this much set aside for climate change and issues of priority.
Thank you, Mantate, for that contribution towards the proposed amendments. Quite comprehensive, and thank you once again. So I'll move on to Senator Watson Kupe. I don't know, what are your thoughts with regards to the proposed amendments? Do you think there was any deliberate effort put towards being sensitive towards the needs of people with disabilities, or as usual, it's business as usual, people just put other needs as priorities and they move forward? What are your thoughts with regards to the proposed amendments?
Thank you, Tariro. There was nothing in connection with the rights of persons with disabilities. It simply says youth, and as the history has proved, if we say youth to women in Zimbabwe, in silent we are saying as long as they have no disability. So there's nothing. I raised that question in Senate, Honorable Mwonzora and Honorable Senator, I hope they were there. It was answered as follows: that when the bill comes to this house, then the people will be. In other words, it's something which will come as an afterthought. The exclusion of disabled youth in the first place was not a mistake. It was deliberate for a purpose, whatever purpose, we don't know. But that is the brief I can say on that one. It has nothing to do. Remember, there's nothing for us without us. That is our clarion call every time. It's a slogan which is internationally recognized. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Watson Kupe. You are very straight to the point. You have just said that there was nothing for people with disabilities in the proposed amendments. It's quite clear. So now I'll also ask our other panelist, Tsepang Nare, what are your views with regards to the proposed amendments of the Constitution? Was there any deliberate moves or deliberate efforts towards being sensitive to the aspirations of people with disabilities? Over to you, Tsepang.
Thank you once again. Thank you so much. According to the United Nations estimate or statistics around disability, it entails that 15% of every population must be persons with disabilities. So there are two issues involved. One, how did Parliament come to agree to a number of 10? How, honestly, because the disaggregation of young people, even those without disability, is not easy. You find that maybe in Nanyukaland there are more young people than in Bulawayo or than in that. When you look at the United Nations statistics, it says 15%. And 15% of 10 is 1.5. Round off to the nearest whole number. That's 2 persons with disabilities and persons with disabilities. And then the rest 8 are those without disabilities. So you can tell that even when they made that decision, they had they didn't have persons with disabilities in mind. Even looking at the years as a result of the women's proportional representation, and yet women have a double jeopardy. The fact, if the state had proposals, we had 3 opportunities in the youth quarter, number 1. Number 2, in the women's quarter. Number 3, the ministers who are chosen at the prerogative of the president, from being chosen to be part of the Ministry of Public Service, Labor and Social Welfare, that all that is not mentioned in this proposed amendment. And as one of the speakers alluded, it was so difficult to participate in this consultation. Speaking from Bulawayo, we had state security apparatus all over. So you couldn't go and attend physically. And even in these virtual meetings, I think it was only an afterthought. So the issue of persons with disabilities only surfaced when they also to be included. I tell you, say, I should always tell you, when you are representing people, you are representing persons with disabilities who are there in each and every constituency. Issues of disability are not only inclined to senatorial representatives in disability, namely Senate Watson Kupe and people, including persons with disabilities. So when they were drafting this bill, really, they had no.
And from what you are saying, what stands out to me is the fact that you are saying if people are indeed genuine to say they want to see the meaningful participation of people with disabilities and even their meaningful representation at all levels of leadership, they must be seen to be walking the talk. So there's an issue of there not being any genuineness. And also you have highlighted that with regards to the parliamentary consultative process, with regards to bill number 2, participation was very difficult. We found ourselves being forced to participate in 50 meetings that were around the country of Zimbabwe in the context of COVID-19. And you yourself have mentioned that participating was so hard. For people to actually go to those parliamentary consultative meetings, it was difficult. And then we ask ourselves that after having said you have widely consulted on bill number 2, is this the voice of the people of Zimbabwe talking in the proposed amendments? Is the voice of the people of Zimbabwe being well represented if the consultative process was actually limited? And you have also mentioned that, as always, the issue of people with disabilities participation at all levels is always an afterthought. Thank you for that, Tsepang. So now what we will do is we'll open plenary session where we'll allow people to ask their questions, make their contributions, make their comments, and then we'll go to the last question, which of course will be what are the recommendations? We'll hear from our panelists what they think needs to be done to ensure that people with disabilities are fully guaranteed in the Constitution, they enjoy equal rights with everybody else, and their representation is one that is meaningful at all levels of society. So now we'll open to the plenary session where if you want to make a contribution, if you want to make a comment, you raise your hand, we recognize your named device, and then we ask you to unmute and you make your contribution. So I'll look through the list of participants to see who has raised their hands so that we can hear what other people think of this discussion today and hear what they can actually contribute to the discussion. So I would ask that your contributions be very brief because we are way behind time, but also just tell us what you think can be done, and what your views are with regards to the topic that we brought for you today to say, does the Constitution adequately locate the needs and the aspirations of people with disabilities? So I'm seeing Masimba Kuchera. You may unmute your mic and make your contribution, say. Go ahead.
All right, thank you very much, Tariro, and thank you very much to the panelists for the presentations. I just want to make 4 observations. The first one, it's clear that the panelists, in one way or the other, point to what I would call systematic exclusion of persons with disabilities. And I think that this is a point that has been prevalent if you go probably to the private sector, if you go to the political parties, if you go to civic society, that systematic exclusion is there. So it could be deliberate, it could be as a matter of how society functions. The second observation that I would want to look at is that I think we, from the presentations, it's clear that people with disabilities are not going to be remembered under this current system if nothing drastic or dramatic happens. So I would want to suggest the following. The first thing is that people with disabilities themselves are supposed to probably then come up with ways to influence this process. So the first thing that happened in this amendment process is that people with disabilities were also able to make their views heard. But I think that people with disabilities should then be able to look at what are the issues that they would want looked at. What are the issues that they would think are appropriate for legislators and presentation? A key ask, not only from people with disabilities, but from everyone. The third observation is around the statistics of the United Nations, which talks about 15%. The Zimstats, the last time I checked, they were saying that in Zimbabwe the population is 10%. I'm not sure how far true that is, but that's what they were saying in the last official statistic. Hopefully, two things will happen. Number one, there will be a provision in the next census so that official statistics will be gathered around the number of persons with disability. Number two, there will also be a process by government through the Ministry of Labor and Social Welfare to actually put together all the statistics around people with disabilities. You know that, for instance, ZEC has a certain number of people with disabilities who registered to vote. The last observation that I would want to make, and I think that this is key. I think it's important, and thank you for bringing together such a panel, and also for ensuring that we also have legislators in the mix who are also listening to these contributions. But I think I want to challenge these legislators who come from political parties. I think that political parties should make the space for people with disabilities more conducive in their own political parties. So the culture of violence, the culture of discrimination, the culture, all those negative cultures that have permeated society and politics in this country should also come to an end. And it's up to the political parties to also do what the Constitution has failed to do. In most instances, we can, as society, lead from the front, and the state can even follow. So when we are looking at some of these issues, I think that it's incumbent upon political parties, it's incumbent upon organizations like the Zimbabwe Council of Churches, even the Christian community in general, to look at how do we start breaking the systematic exclusion of people with disabilities so that the state can have something to learn. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your contribution, Masimba. Comprehensive recommendations over there that you made. And I think these are things that we need to keep into account. And if possible, if we are now lobbying and also trying to interact at national level with the issues, we bring these issues to the fore because they are very important. You spoke of systematic exclusion of people with disabilities, which has been the common thread running through this meeting that we have today. You also spoke of something that really speaks of a certain level of hopelessness, where you say that people with disabilities are not going to be remembered unless certain things are met, unless certain requirements are met. And these requirements, you have outlaid them as follows. People with disabilities should come up with ways in which they influence processes, meaning that they should organize themselves effectively for them to influence very critical local and national processes. Then you also spoke of the issue where legislators should also be part of the key asks for people with disabilities. You also spoke of the issue of statistics of the UN, that there's provision in the next census, there's need for an official statistics database that speaks to the composition of people with disabilities, that speaks to the statistics of people with disabilities. Then you also spoke of the issue where political parties need to reform first from within with regards to the agenda of inclusion of people with disabilities. Thank you for that, Masimba. So let me recognize the other hands that have been raised. I see Love More Rambiao. You may unmute your mic and make your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tariro. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Hello?
I can hear you, Love More. You can go ahead.
Okay. Also, if you look at the Constitution of Zimbabwe, it contains no definition of a disability. There's no definition of a disability. And the two categories of disability that are recognized are physical and mental impairments. I don't know whether that was deliberate to leave out other categories of disability. And also, if you look at subsidiary acts, like the Criminal Procedure and Evidence Act, the Geneva Conventions Act, the Mental Health Act, the Criminal Law Codification and Reform Act, Social Welfare Assistance Act, they refer to people with mental impairments in derogatory and discriminatory terms, like mentally defective, intellectually handicapped, and mentally disordered. And in terms of imbecility, idiocy, and the like. Those are very demeaning, degrading, belittling, stigmatizing, devaluing, and debasing terms for persons with disabilities. And yet, these acts are countenanced by the judiciary and government. I think there's urgent need to reform such acts and align them to the Constitution, so that the people with disabilities are respected and included in processes like the rest of the other people in society. Thank you.
Thank you, Love More Yambiaro. Thank you for your contribution. I think what I'll do now is go to recognizing other hands, those who would want to make their contributions. I'm seeing there's no other hand. I don't know if we have exhausted those who want to comment or make contributions. Okay, I see Matthias Moyo. You may unmute your mic and make your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Tariro. Good afternoon. I have been wondering how long the struggle will last us. After 40 years of independence and the state or the government still do not recognize people with disabilities. I've been looking at how children play at home. Those with disabilities, when they are playing with the able-bodied children, they will always try to portray themselves as able-bodied children. And I am discovering that the state also wants people with disabilities to behave like able-bodied people, even where they need to be helped. All systems seem to be on paper, but practically they don't apply to life. One of the things that I think is lacking is the will to make some changes. Unless the government have that will to make those changes, we'll cry the next 100 years, because it is the government that needs to implement all these good systems which have been put on place, or which are supposed to be there, but they are always trodden down and they are not recognized when it comes to making some decisions. We are being decided for. We are not involved in decision making, yet our situation at hand. Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution. Thank you for your comment. I'm now trying to see if I can recognize other hands as well. I'm seeing Johan Marufu. Your hand is up. You may unmute your mic and make your contribution. Thank you. Johan Marufu, you can go ahead. Okay. I think Johan is not there, so we can move on to Joseph Kufa. You may unmute your mic and make your contribution. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, you can go ahead. Thank you.
I would like to thank Senator Watson for making an observation that there is a deliberate exclusion of issues or issues to do with us. Now, the problem is, it seems at corporate level, at government level, there is this abuse of the adage, disability is not inability. And consequently, society is taking advantage of that adage and not defining us as if to say, in one way or the other, everybody is disabled in some way. Now, as long as our legislators, including Senator Watson, do not fight that for us, then we will remain crybabies for the next year, 1,000 or more years. We need our legislators to act on that. As the generality of the people, we cannot do much. Those people represent us in parliament, so they should speak on our behalf. When we hold forums like this, those things should be taken seriously and on board. When they go to parliament, they are able to articulate on such issues. Consequently, as long as they do not talk on our behalf, nothing will be done. They may cry on our behalf, but that is not enough. We need concrete action where they remind those that are in power to realize that disability should have a definition. Because if you don't define, everybody would fit in. And when everybody fits in, then resources won't come. When everybody fits in, whatever comes at the behest of whoever is doing it, and not as a constitutional right. And as long as things do not come as a constitutional right, then they may not get to us, because there won't be any constitutional obligation to whoever should do that for persons with disabilities. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much for your contribution. That was very important. I think what I caught on was that legislators like Senator Watson Kupe, you are saying that they should really take a radical stance and speak to these issues whilst in the Senate, in Parliament. And you are also saying that there is no need to just speak alone, but to also walk the talk by concretizing what is being said with action, to remind people in power that people with disabilities must be well defined in the laws of Zimbabwe. Thank you for that. So let me recognize other hands. Johan Marufu has said, please come back to me. I'm now here. So you may unmute your mic and make your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Tari. My contribution comes in this format. The first thing that we need to do is have the disability bill, according to what is coming on with the amendments, the disability commission to be enshrined also in the constitution as a chapter 8 commission that will give it power to operate like any other commission under the chapter 8. And the second thing is these subsidiary acts that we have, the subordinate acts, the Urban Councils Act, the Rural District Councils Act, and the other acts that require the people with disability to be self-representing themselves. We also need to make sure that they speak as such, that we have councillors, we have MPs, we have senators. And on the quota system, yes, Senator Kupe spoke about it, that maybe 10 is not enough, because roughly we are saying is 10% is 1% per province. And then how do the parties now select the person with disability to fit in, which that will never happen, because first of all, they will consider persons without disabilities and will come last. So we just need a separate quota system that may not or is not necessarily linked to any political party, because within our representation, we are not all political beings. We don't belong to any political beings as a matter of mandate. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne Marufu. What stands out to me is you're saying that there is need for a separate quota system that's not politically linked or inclined, but one that speaks to people who are outside political parties, but who are with disabilities, who want to contribute towards leadership and having leadership positions. Then you also spoke about the disability bill, that there is need for Chapter 8 commission that is specific to disabilities. Thank you for that. And you also spoke about there is need to make sure that leadership positions represent people with disabilities in law. Thank you for your contribution. So I would also want to recognize other hands. I'm seeing Dick Kazumbuleni. You may unmute your mic and make your contribution. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Ndauya pano tichitaura kuti nyaya yedisability haina kutanga kutaurwa nhasi, yakatanga kutaurwa kare, ende uye kune vanonyora tinoziva kubva kare, kubva 1980 tichingotaura tichichema, hapana kana chimwe chete chiri kuitika. Saka zvatinoda ndezvekuti pane vanoisa mitemo, pane vanonyora zvinofanira kuitika munyika, let's have a policy inotaura kuti zvichave chisungu kuti vanhu vane disability vachange vachitorwa zvakadai, vachange vachibatwa zvakadai kwese kwavanoenda, ungave kumaministries, ungave muparliament, ungave kuzvikoro, nekuti papepa zvinonyorwa kunzi zvikoro ngazvive inclusive, but hapana kana chikoro chimwe chete chaunoona paine blame, hapana kana chikoro chaunoona chehurumende chaunoona pane varairidzi vari kuticha nesign language. Unoenda kuna headmaster haatogoni kana kuziva kuti otaura sei nesign language, kana kuti kune uyo asiri kuona angamubatsire sei kuti angave ari pachikoro. Saka kana tikaramba tichingotaura zvisiri kuiswa mubumbiro remutemo kana kuti zvisiri kuiswa mupolisi yekuti zvave kutoitwa, ticharamba tichichema kusvika mheno. Ndinotenda maita basa.
Thank you so much for your contribution. From what you have said, I think you were giving an obligation to legislators. You were saying that they need to formulate a policy that sort of like criminalizes those who sideline people with disabilities at all levels of society. Thank you for that contribution. So let me recognize other hands. I'm seeing Patricia Michelle, a female voice at last. Thank you. You may unmute your mic and make your contribution. Go ahead.
Yeah, I greet you all in the mighty name of Jesus Christ. Mine is a comment over the disability on grounds of yekuti vana ava havanyatsogamuchirika, even mukatarisa machurches paanovakwawo havaconsidewo madisabilities kuti vanowanawo dzidziso, kana even kumasunday school maticho anenge achigonawo sign language anokwanisawo kuvabatsira kuti vaunderstand, vangofilawo kuti vari kugamuchirika muchechi. It's like ameno zvazvinongori. Saka ini ndiri kungoti dai zvaconsiderwa even kumachechi chaiko kuti pavanoendawo vawanewo shoko iroro rigonawo kuvabatsirawo pavanenge vari kukura, vangofilawo kuti yes they are part of the congregation, vasaite sevano sideline.
Thank you for your contribution. Thank you so much. I'm also now trying to look through our participants to see if there are any raised hands that I may not have recognized. So I think those who still have their hands raised, maybe they've forgotten to put down their hands because we gave them an opportunity to make their contributions. Okay, I'm seeing Timothy Mudarikwa, he has raised his hand, and Bernard Madzivire. So with those two, I think we can then move on to our last session. So Timothy Mudarikwa, you may unmute your mic, make your contribution, ask your question or comment. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tariro. Am I being heard?
Yes, we can hear you. You can go ahead.
Thank you so much. Yes. Yeah, thank you so much, ZCC, for giving us this grand opportunity to rally around this very important topic. I think our voice as PWDs has been well amplified by Senators Kupe and Timire, and as well by Mantate Mlochwa and Tsepang Nare. It was indicated, I think it was through the presentation by one of the presenters, that the constitutional amendment process was mistakenly driven up bottom. And I think this was very much calculated when it could be vice versa. And at the end of the day, as PWDs, we had no opportunity to inform the process at all. I suggest that as PWDs or persons with disabilities, we have it recorded that this process does not concern us at all. I wish that it be recorded that as persons with disabilities, we divorce ourselves from this process because the nation or the government has divorced us in the first place. And I suggest that, and that it be recorded that we don't support the amendments that are being sold to the nation, including persons with disabilities. And I suggest that we start as persons with disabilities ourselves, a process where we demand through advocacy and lobbying that amendments to the Constitution, which are truly inclusive for ourselves, be made by government. I know that we might not be heard, at least not immediately, but the nation and our various audience will take it to book that as persons with disabilities, this is our position, because we are very disappointed with the processes and what is going on. In the fact, by the fact that we are totally excluded through and through, and nobody seems to give a damn about persons with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your contribution. Very valid contribution. One that needs to be taken into account and considered. Thank you so much. So I'll move on to Bernard Madzivire. You may unmute your mic and make your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Tariro. I would like to thank all my colleagues. They have said much to help us come out of this dilemma. My contribution comes in this way. We have got MPs in every constituency, and those MPs are not doing us justice as people with disabilities when they go to parliament. Because we have never heard them talk to us. We have never heard them talk to us about what's happening there in parliament. I don't know how they came up with this amendment. We thought probably because they know it already. I heard the MP Gonese saying where resources permit whatever we have. It has been there for a long time. They know it. If the MPs came up with this amendment, then this amendment doesn't suit us. As my colleague Mdariko was saying, let it be registered that we are not interested in this type of amendment. It doesn't concern us. And one other thing, we would like to say when they align their acts to the Constitution, they should include the aspect of disability in every act that's going to go through Parliament. If there is nothing to do, there is nothing said about disability, they shouldn't pass it. That is, if they are in support of us. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I would like to also recognize comments within our comment or chat section. I think I will just read them through as we then go to the closing remarks of our participants. So I'm seeing that someone was saying that Tsepang is right when he says that people with disabilities are an afterthought. True, Tsepang, we need to stand in for ourselves as people with disabilities. They don't even think of us. Then Dick Kazumbuleni says red tape and bureaucracy is a limitation to access scholarships, health facilities, and all that Senator Douglas Mwonzora said, which is meant for people with disabilities. Then another contribution is that churches, political parties, and government itself do more lipstick love to us, but not wholeheartedly appreciating us and including us in key decision-making boards, even in society at large. This is from Dick Kazumbuleni again. Then there's someone who, Jack Kufa, says that there is lack of definition of the people with disabilities constitutionally. Then Entrance Takaidza says that it's every citizen's responsibility to make sure the Constitution of Zimbabwe recognizes people with disabilities. Then Pastor Twelihle Moyo from UCCSA says, I want to challenge the Christian community to embrace the issues of inclusion in church structures and committees because these seem to be exclusive. Then Joanne Marufu says 10% disability population in Zimbabwe is a political statement that is meant to justify the meager resources allocated to people with disabilities. Resources will never be adequate or permitting, that's their nature. Then Tintin Rada Foundation says, to the members in the Zimbabwe Council of Churches, please help us raise awareness to churches that people with disabilities do not come to church as a source of demonstration of power during these deliverance sessions in church. This is a form of stigma within the church. Then Love Morabiao says, we thank Zimbabwe Council of Churches for endeavoring to make its church buildings accessible to people with disabilities, but they should go further than that. They should build universal design into everything they do. That is the design of programs, products, services, and environments so that they can be used to all with little or no modification. Then Love More Timburwa says that there is lack of will for minority groups to survive. Then Tapiwa K. Tsikai says accessibility and inclusion must start within the church, as is read in Hebrews 12, verses 13. Then Joyce Chaluka says there are many persons with disabilities who are lawyers who can be engaged whenever issues of disability and legislation are to be discussed. So these are the comments in the chat section. And I think I've recognized all the people who have raised their hands. So I think we have come to a point where we'll conclude our meeting for today with closing remarks from our panelists and of course closing remarks from Reverend Samuel Sfelani from the Zimbabwe Council of Churches. And then we'll conclude that the meeting is closed. So back to my panelists. I think I'll just pick them up randomly from the participants that are showing on my screen. Honorable Innocent Gonese, what are your closing remarks with regards to the discussion that we had today? Briefly, please.
Thank you very much, Chariro. I want to begin by thanking all the contributions. I think I got some very, very passionate contributions. And I believe that we need to continue this process of engagement. One thing which I want to correct though is that as Parliament, when you look at this particular piece of legislation, the amendment bill which is before us, it was not initiated by us, the members of Parliament. It came from the executive. And earlier on, I alluded to the fact that there was no process of consultation. But I think that going forward, we acknowledge that there are gaps in the current constitution, and that in an ideal world, we would want to have amendments to it so that the rights of people with disabilities can be realized. But going forward, I think that we must also look at the issue of the policies. We must also look at the issue of implementation of what we already have. I think that it can go a long way to address some of the concerns which have been raised here. When you look at the issue of the budget, for instance, you find that inadequate resources are made available to the Ministry of the Public Service, we would have wanted as Parliament to engage the people out there to find out what has been done in the light of the COVID epidemic to ensure that people with disabilities are taken care of and are catered for. And the biggest challenge that we have is that inadequate resources are made available to that particular and very important ministry. I also believe that we need to empower people. Obviously, on the issue of representation, the issue of quotas is important. But I believe that if people with disabilities have got access to education, they are able to, I think one of the contributors mentioned earlier on, that we don't want a situation where people with disabilities are regarded as a charity case. We want to have a situation where they are given opportunities to improve themselves. And this can only be done by ensuring that the rights to education.
Okay, fine. Are we supposed to say these things now? Nah, I'm thinking.
And I believe that in terms of the engagement, which I was alluding to earlier on, it is also important for the advocacy to continue to engage the various portfolio committees, particularly those which have got a relevant responsibilities, particularly the portfolio committee on the public service, labor and social welfare. I think that is a very important committee to engage so that some of the issues can be well articulated. But at the end of the day, I also want to say that sometimes we are let down by the executive. They lack the political will, they lack the commitment. And this is one of the challenges that we have as a nation. I mentioned the issue of the lack of consultation, but in terms of implementation, in terms of making sure that some of the provisions which we already have are realized, we find that it is lacking. So those are my closing remarks. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for coming to our meeting, Honorable Gonese. We know that you are a busy man, but you made the time to come to this meeting to contribute, to hear the views as well. I'm sure you will take them forward as well, what you have heard from the constituents of people with disabilities. Thank you for making the time. Then I would also want to recognize our viewers on Facebook who have been following the live stream on SlyMedia of this conversation that we are having today. We thank you and we recognize you for your comments and for liking the page and also for bringing your questions. Thank you so much. Then I'll go forward and ask Mantate Mlochwa to give her closing remarks as well. Go ahead, Mantate, unmute yourself, make your closing remarks.
Thank you so much. I think one of the things that I would love to see Zimbabwe doing, coming first from the government itself, moving down to everyone, every stakeholder that is involved in this, this journey towards a democratic, towards an inclusive and equal Zimbabwean society. I think it's very important that we sit down and actually have a demographic mapping, because one of the things that we also fail to understand is that within this community of persons with disability, there are also different demographics. You look at women, they've got their own unique experiences. You look at children, young people, then you look at persons with disability living in rural communities. You've got persons with disability living in urban societies. You also have persons with disability that need assistance and those that can assist themselves. But you also break it down as well. There's differences in terms of their visual impairments, auditory impairment, physical or mobility challenges. Then when you break it down again, the issues of sign language itself, if you come with the sign language that there's a formalized sign language and then there's a sign language that they grow up to learn within the communities that they come from. So at the end of the day, I think the reason why we're constantly coming here to say 2 people in parliament representing persons with disability is not enough. And the quota system that we introduced should not be us fighting for one person within a youth quota to represent persons with disability. We should be able to sit down and say, what is the spectrum of demographics within the community of persons with disability? And how do we make sure that we actually have people in parliament or whatever decision-making platform that represent a majority of these people within that demographic? So yeah, I think at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is that we will continue to have these demands, to have these conversations until we start to deliver on the promises that we make, or at least until we start addressing those things. Because when someone keeps saying something is not, it's not empowering me or something is disadvantaging me, it is our duty as a society, as government, as people to come in and say, how is it not how is it not empowering you? How is it disadvantaging you? And if they're able to communicate that to us, it is also our responsibility to do something about it, so that at the end of the day, this inclusive Zimbabwe that we talk about so much can actually go more than just being this ideal on paper to a more practical society that everyone can benefit from.
All right, thank you, Mantate, for those closing remarks. I'm realizing that our Senator Rejoice Timire may have left the meeting, and I'm also realizing that Senator Douglas Mwonzora as well may have left the meeting, so they may not be able to give their closing remarks. But I'll recognize Sepang Nare, you may go ahead and make your closing remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Tariro. What I would like to say is that we have the Persons with Disabilities Bill currently before Parliament, including the disability policy. And the Persons with Disabilities Bill seeks to domesticate the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So we can use this international instrument to empower persons with disabilities, because as I have alluded earlier, that the UN statistics do indicate that 15% of every population must be persons with disabilities. So we can use such provisions to benefit persons with disabilities in terms of decision making and in terms of reclaiming their spaces. Because 40 years down the line, 40 years after attaining independence, surely persons with disabilities must be given a platform to set an agenda, lead that agenda, and ensure that it's led to completion. So persons with disabilities are capable. And if there is such a provision within the Persons with Disabilities Act, once the President has signed it, I'm sure we can witness significant strides. But we need also, as persons with disabilities, to continue amplifying our voices in calling for constitutional amendments, especially amending Section 22 of the Constitution, while also giving awareness to the general public, because Section 83 is part of the Bill of Rights. So if you are to amend Section 83, it will be through a referendum. So we have a normal task before us. And lastly, what I really want to say, especially to policymakers, those in positions of influence, they need to know that every human being is valuable, that his or her value is ascertained by what he or she has to offer. So as persons with disabilities, we are very valuable. In actual fact, you are underutilizing the value that persons with disabilities have. But for you to realize what they have to offer, you simply have to open up spaces. And believe me, as persons with disabilities, we have the capacity and the capability to transform Zimbabwe's future discourse. All that's needed is that political will. Thank you.
Thank you, Tsepang, for those closing remarks, and thank you for making the time for coming to this engagement. You have always been consistent in participating in these meetings that we have convened and facilitated. Thank you so much. So I'm seeing that Senator Rejoice Timire is in the meeting. So just last remarks and closing remarks. Senator Timire, you may go ahead briefly, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to thank Zimbabwe Council of Churches to come up with this discussion, because it's really an eye-opener to us all, and to engage with parliamentarians, to hear from the horse's mouth. For us, persons with disability, really it's a big opportunity for us to understand and really to engage them. And I also want to say, if it is possible, for today we're talking with one arm of the government, which is the parliamentarians. If it is possible, if we can also we can talk with the other arm, the executive, so that they do really understand us, where we are coming from, because the input which is coming from persons with disability is something which is so powerful for them to hear for themselves, to say this is what persons with disabilities are saying. Because all these things which you are talking about are not drafted in parliament, but they are drafted by the executive. So I think if we can also engage the executive, and I say to my colleagues, the persons with disability, to say, okay, if you read the Bible, the Exodus, it means the journey, which means we are in a journey to achieve what we want. So together, for us to achieve what we want, we have to move together in a united as we are, to come up with the really tangible results. Let's hope the journey, I think, will reach where we want to reach. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Timire. I think I'll also then open this opportunity for Senator Watson Coupe to give his closing remarks. Senator, over to you.
Thank you, Tariro. My few words is that thank you, Zimbabwe Council of Churches, for creating this space. You've given us the opportunity to hold this meeting. For us, the two senators, I think you created also a constituency for us to meet. You created us to host those people who are interested to hear what is happening in Parliament, and we'll always remember you for that. One big thing about this gathering was that it was a no-hold-barred discussions. There was nothing sacred that we cannot talk about, as long as it's about the topic at hand. And thank you for that. And I also want to take this opportunity to say, I don't know whether he's still there, Dr. Gondongwe. I've read a lot about him because our background is on Methodism. My first impact, my first with Christianity was through Western Methodism. I read a PhD document on the University of Natal, and I enjoyed it. One day I will meet him. I think I have to look for him. Sorry to talk about that, but I wanted to say the meeting gave me an opportunity to also understand what the people are thinking about. And the Council of Churches, Zimbabwe Council of Churches, you might think we are doing just something small. This is very important. To me, it doesn't surprise me, because when we were at the Constitutional Commission, I think my brother Timothy Mdari was also there. We had somebody, a reverend from the Lutheran Church, who was really particular about these issues about disability. I'm not going to mention his name, but what I'm simply saying is that what we are doing, Zimbabwe Council of Churches, keep on doing that. We thank you for doing this. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Watson Coupe, for those closing remarks. And actually, we thank you for facilitating this process with us, for you. We thank you for always being open and wanting to engage with us when we try to push our broader national building agenda as Zimbabwe Council of Churches. Thank you so much. So with that having been said, I think we have heard the views from our parliamentarians, we've heard the views from our senators, we've heard the views from the people with disabilities themselves with regards to what they think the Constitution says about their needs, if it adequately locates their aspirations. And the proposed amendments was the sensitivity towards what they aspire for as people with disabilities. So with that, we conclude the meeting, but before we do that, I would like to open the space and ask Reverend Samuel Sfelani from the Zimbabwe Council of Churches to give us closing remarks before we end the meeting. Over to you, Reverend Sfelani. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tariro, for leading this conversation very well this afternoon. Thank you very much. May I take this opportunity to thank our panelists. Just in order to save time, I will not go into their names, but all our panelists, we are very grateful. You made the discussion lively, and we thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to engage with the people who managed to go in. This is not the last that we will be knocking on your doors. I think it must be Senator Timeria who said this is a journey, and we hope we will continue to accompany each other on this journey. As a church, I think we need to appreciate that we affirm the sanctity of human life and that we are all created in the image of God. And because of that, that is where we derive our dignity, whether we feel we are better than others or not. But I'll just share as we close one thing that happened last week when we invited a very powerful preacher, Reverend Mary Chipoka from Mogenster. She is hard of speech, so she preached using sign language. And that is when I realized that, I myself, when I look at myself as not living with a disability, as not being with a disability, but I then appreciated that, I felt that I had to do something for my own edification, to also learn sign language, because it is a language that all of us ought to learn. So I felt it's important even for us as church to not just be a space where we have such kinds of discussions, but such that church becomes a place where everyone can express themselves and be able to worship God in any way that they find possible, to gain access to our churches, not just the church building, but also just for the church to become a space where even people with disabilities will feel at home. And ultimately, I feel this is something that we need to do as a nation, so that we can all be able to express ourselves and also reach our potential. Just to conclude, I think it would not be fair for me not to say this. We really wish to convey our heartfelt apology for the hacking that took place. We are sorry we had to go through that. As we continue to learn how to secure these meetings in the new normal, our communications team, we will do better in the next conversation that we're going to have. So please do accept our sincere apologies for the disruptions that we went through. But I'm glad that we were resilient and managed to go through with the discussion. So without further ado, may I again thank our panelists and say we will continue as the ZCC to work as much as we can through different platforms in communities, at policy level, but also to engage like-minded organizations as we continue to champion the cause of people living with disability, but also enabling them to be able to explore their giftings for the benefit of the whole nation. So thank you very much for being with us, and we hope to meet you in other discussions. May God bless you, and thank you very much.
Reverend Svelani, before you go, may you please just give us a brief closing prayer so that we can then fully close the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You just had to emphasize a brief. No, that's fine. Let us pray.
At SlyMedia Productions, we offer live streaming services to companies willing to.
We thank you, Father, for the discussion and the conversations that we had. Conversations that give us hope. Conversations that build each other up. We thank you, Father, for our panelists who were with us this afternoon, and for the many things that we learned. And as we go forward, we pray that you may continue to open our eyes, open our hearts and that we may be able to open our arms to new learning. And as we continue that, this dignity that you bestowed on each and every one of us may actually be lived and enjoyed. As we go our separate ways, we pray that you continue to guide and protect us and be with us in all that we do. This we leave in your hands as we pray through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Reverend Sfelani. So our meeting ends here, colleagues. Thank you so much. We can leave the meeting.
At SlyMedia Productions, we offer live streaming services to companies willing to reach a worldwide audience. We have the capacity to live stream debates from various locations for a wide range of clients.
And our online audience, we welcome you back.
We follow them and help build Zimbabwe brand on a positive note.
On the second report on citizens' perceptions.
And for us, our interest has always been around how do we leverage technology to communicate policy, to communicate public issues.
At SlyMedia Productions, we offer live streaming services to companies willing to reach a worldwide audience. We have the capacity to live stream debates from various locations for a wide range of clients.
And our online audience, we welcome you back.
We follow them and help build Zimbabwe brand on a positive note.
On the second report on citizens' perceptions.
And for us, our interest has always been around how do we leverage technology to communicate policy, to communicate public issues.
When you think of reaching the ever-growing internet audience with your video adverts, think SlyMedia TV Online. If you want to pre-package TV programs, documentaries, weddings and church services, think SlyMedia Productions, building bridges. Your TV on the go, anytime, anywhere, worldwide.